Welcome to Medical Myths, Legends, and Fairy Tales. I'm your host, Dr. Alan Christensen. Look, you know that between the latest online fads and the crazy media headlines, it's easier than ever to get confused about your health. And you and I just want to feel better and live longer. We want to know what works. And we can't wait for further studies. We need to make decisions today based on the best evidence we've got. Well, that's exactly what this show is here for. So let's get to it.
Hi there, this is Dr. Linda Kashaba from Integrative Health. Would you like some help with your thyroid? We would absolutely love to help you out. And guess what? We can even do remote care. Please call us today at 480-657-0003 to set up your first appointment. If you mention code podcast20, you will get 20% off from your first visit. That phone number again is 480-657-0003, and the code is podcast20. Can't wait to meet you.
So I'm sure you've heard that fermented foods are good for your intestines, and that what's good for your intestines is good for your overall health. But you may not have known that some of the products you can buy that purport to be fermented foods really aren't at all the same as the products used in research to establish the claims. And you also may not know that some fermented foods are really just bad for you in some situations. And then also some are more of a fit than others. I was really jazzed to spend some time with Summer Bock. She's a dear friend, also a microbiologist. She's had a really thorough background in the whole fermented world for quite some time. She coined the term gut rebuilding, which is now just like a pretty standard thing. And she trains fermentationists in her fermentationist certification program. We went deep into all things fermented, including her getting into a bathtub with some fermented foods at one point. Lots of fun stories and lots of fascinating things came from this conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Hey, Dr. C back with you, and super jazzed. This is one of my dearest friends. We got Summer Bock with us in the house, and we're going to go deep into all things fermented food. So, hey, Summer.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. I absolutely love your show, and I'm just really thrilled that we get to talk about this today.
Yay. And this is super important. You know, fermented foods are hot and they're thought about, but you know, you're not someone new to this arena. You've been in this world for some time, and you know, you've got the credentials to make sense of it. So how could someone possibly misuse fermented foods? How could things ever go badly?
I mean, it's such an interesting question because, you know, everybody's recommending fermented foods right now. Like everywhere you go, it's all excitement, like get some fermented foods in. So I have to say, you know, fermented foods, they're never a bad idea, right? But there's just specific ferments that you should be avoiding depending on your health concerns. So don't be afraid of ferments. Just try to figure out, depending on which health concerns you're dealing with, figure out the right fermented foods to be eating and the fermented foods that you should be avoiding for that specific health concern until you resolve it.
You know, this is cool. So I think about, you could almost say like vitamins, like, well, I've just got a mega dose of vitamin A and now I'm all set on my vitamins. Well, not so much. They're different, they're specific. And so what you're telling us is that the same is true for fermented foods, huh?
Absolutely. And it is, you know, fermented foods are similar to vitamins in the sense that you really should be eating a small amount on a regular basis. You know, you're not going to do a mega dose one time and you're set. You know?
So incorporated regularly, small amounts with the food. So are there some particular scenarios in which people make common mistakes? Like what's something you might see happen to where someone just, I don't know, they're trying to improve their health. They want to use fermented foods. They get the relevance, but it's just not connecting, right? What's a typical pitfall that could occur?
Well, one of the common mistakes is thinking that the fermented foods at the grocery store are the traditional form of these fermented foods. So what I mean by that is, like, let's use kefir as an example. Kefir is very popular. Dairy kefir, it's sold in the yogurt section. And when you look at the studies that have been done on this and you read all the research, you actually find out that kefir is an amazing food that wow, like you read them and you're like, everybody should be drinking dairy kefir. I mean, from literally like topical use as an antibiotic to supplementing this in babies who weren't able to be breastfed, all the way to some of these very incredible studies around potential decreases in tumors. And it's just got some really beautiful research behind it. So kefir just sounds like such an amazing food. You're like, yes, this is what I want in my life. But then if you look at what they're selling in the grocery store, it's not the same thing that's being studied. And no one knows this hardly. I mean, and it just blows my mind. So what you're buying in the grocery store is very similar to yogurt. It's really a kefir-like beverage, and it's made using powdered starter culture. So it's just some bacteria that were grown in a lab. It's usually 1 or 2 strains of bacteria that they isolated from traditional kefir, and they propagate them and grow them as a starter culture so that they can control it. You know how we do in the United States with our food. We want everything, exact and controlled. And
sure.
we're a little bit, like the health department is a little bit afraid of fermented foods because this is what people used, a long time ago as a way to store and preserve food before they had refrigeration. And so it's actually, we have a lot of safety reports behind this as well, but it's hard. We haven't quite caught up in terms of, our culture as like the health department. They haven't really gotten on board yet. So everything tries to get standardized, industrialized. How do we make huge batches, mass quantities to feed a lot of people and create a viable business? It's a little bit it's less labor intensive to add these powdered starter cultures, but these, again, are not the traditional ways that you make dairy kefir. When you're making it traditionally, you're using something called a SCOBY, which is, it's just a word that stands for symbiotic community of bacteria and yeasts, SCOBY. And these SCOBYs for dairy kefir look like little cauliflower florets made out of gelatin. They're squishy. And they're really cute little guys. And the coolest thing about them is that we can't make them. They spontaneously grew thousands of years ago. And the story, I'll tell you real quick because it's fascinating. The story is that, this is back in the day, somewhere in the Caucasus Mountains, and people were nomadic and they had their cows and they had their, animals and they're doing their thing. And milk, it goes bad. They didn't have refrigeration. So what did they do? They would use the stomachs of the animals to store milk in, and they would, let the milk naturally sour. But you still have a chance when the milk is souring of it going bad, right? And so over time, it's believed that they kept using these containers and kept doing this over and over and over. And at some point, these cultures grew into a little symbiotic community, and they created these little, what they call kefir grains, these scobies. And the belief is that then the people who were handling these went, oh my gosh, look, and they pulled it out and then started plopping them into the next batch. And realized that there was a relationship there with the ones that they added these to wouldn't spoil. They would naturally ferment and stay stable. So it's fascinating. And so we've been handing these down for literally thousands of years. And so if you get your hands on some dairy kefir grains, they're ancient probiotics.
That's really cool. And not at all the same as commercial grocery store or health food store kefir.
They're not using that. They can't right now at this point in time, at least from everything I've read. I don't think there's anyone that's certified to be using the traditional methods and selling it. I could be wrong. I mean, we do get, there are regular updates, but last time I checked, there wasn't anybody making it the traditional way of being able to sell it. You might find people at the farmer's market doing it because sometimes it's not as regulated. But
I wonder if that comes up under some of the raw milk restrictions or what the barriers would be, or
a little bit around that. And it has more to do with, there's very high restrictions on dairy. So when it comes to the health department, dairy foods are considered like a high possible, foodborne pathogen vector, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like it could very easily cause some sort of foodborne pathogen if it's not done properly. We're very paranoid about dairy in our country. And because of that, there's a lot of regulations. And so when you're using dairy kefir grains, what happens is that the pH is very acidic right around the grains. Mm-hmm. And so in order to make this work, they would have to come up with a way to like stir and they'd have to add another step in the process of fermentation to ensure that the pH was staying stable throughout the entire mixture.
So it's not acidic right around the grain, but the rest of it as well. And that's to keep other negative pathogens from growing? Or?
Yes, that's actually really, that's a great thing to talk about here, is that this acidity that's created that sour flavor in yogurt, the sour flavor in kefir, that acidity is lactic acid. And that's what the little probiotics are making. And that lactic acid is used as like a natural antimicrobial by these organisms, and it prevents foodborne pathogens from growing.
Yeah, we hear about the acidophilus varieties, and Phyllis, loving, they're lovers of acidic environments. So that all makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So kefir is a great example for me of like, you've got to learn how to make this at home if you're interested. If you can handle dairy, and that's something you want to try, then this is one that just, you've got to make it at home. You've got to get your hands on some of these little dairy kefir scobies and do it yourself. It's actually pretty easy. And it's a really fun process. I think everybody should learn to ferment, quite honestly.
That's really cool. And we didn't discuss this, but I'll certainly want to tell people that they can go to you to learn more about that. If they go to summerbock.com, or what's the best site these days? Or
I would go to gutrebuilding.com, and I've got
gutrebuilding.com.
Gutrebuilding.com. Okay. Yep. Thanks.
Yeah, I have training and programs for that. That's really cool. So one misconception is just kefir, a lot of research on that. And I think about, for example, botanical medications. There will often be studies on a very specific subspecies and a particular clinical outcome and used in an exacting way. And then people will think that anything that has that same name will work like that. So this is probably even, what you're describing is even a more dramatic example of that disconnect.
Absolutely. Very similar. Yeah. Yes.
So that's an example of it just not working, just not being the same thing or not being effective. What are some scenarios in which you can have a really good outcome? Someone could buy a product, either maybe a commercial product, if that's a possible answer, or something they make on their own, in which for a particular condition, it could be really useful.
Yeah. So, there are some great fermented foods out there that, even sold in the store or made at home, however you do it. But like, let's use the example of, let's say, leaky gut. So, leaky gut is obviously kind of a term that's obviously like overused, right? But when we're talking about like digestive issues, leaky gut issues, where people are like, yeah, I'm having all of these reactions to foods, and, they've got kind of all of those symptoms, in those situations, I think that fermented vegetables are an excellent option for these folks. That's just a great example. And when you're buying fermented vegetables, you want to make sure that you're buying ones that are in glass, hopefully that were also fermented in glass or stainless steel or crocks that are, food grade ceramic. And this is like part of the discussion that we all need to be having with some of these manufacturers, asking people like, how was this fermented? What was it fermented in? So many of the big manufacturers are fermenting it in plastic, which when you put an acidic food in plastic, it's going to leach those chemicals. And we just don't want those in our bodies. So even if it's BPA free, there's still other plastic chemicals that could get leached out. But yeah, fermented vegetables is a great one for folks with digestive issues. I mean, I've worked with many, many people where, within 24 hours to even just like 7 days. So within a week, most people get the effects pretty quick. Their issues around constipation are alleviated dramatically. I mean, some people go to having normal bowel movements just within 24 hours of consuming it, and it continues, no relapse with it.
That's really cool. And so let's say someone who doesn't even have a specialty or an exotic grocery store, so typical grocery stores. So I guess the thing that I would see the most would be products like sauerkraut or kimchi. So are there some good options that way in typical grocery stores?
There are. I mean, kimchis often have, there's really good options out there for kimchi. Yeah, just look for the ones in the glass jars, ideally. And yeah, you're going to find some really good stuff out there.
That's pretty cool. I see those in pretty much every grocery store, so that's an easy one.
Absolutely. And you might be noticing that I'm not mentioning kombucha.
Ah, okay. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, because, kombucha is one of those interesting ferments where, I love it that people are getting excited. I actually think of kombucha as a gateway ferment. It helps people's palate adjust to the sour flavors. They often feel a little jolt of energy from the caffeine in it. And so there's like a little bit of sugar. It's really the trifecta because there's hints of alcohol too. So it's like alcohol, sugar, caffeine. I mean, no wonder it's such a popular item right now. Wow. And there's not enough alcohol to make you drunk with the normal kinds of kombucha sold. They test them to make sure, but there's still trace amounts. I mean, it's there. It's part of the process of kombucha fermentation. But the reason that I'm not recommending kombucha for my folks that are dealing with digestive issues is because it does contain the sugar, of course. Caffeine is often a stimulant that isn't always very good for the digestive lining. I find that it can be an irritant for a lot of folks. And then the other thing is that we think of kombucha as this probiotic beverage, but if you look at the most popular brands out on the market, the ones that most people are drinking, they're adding in these Bacillus coagulans, which is a very specific type. It's the GBI 30 6086. And so that's like a bacteria name, Bacillus coagulans GBI 30 6086. And the reason that it has these numbers after it is it's actually a patented probiotic. Which means that it's sold by a corporation. And the way that they were able to patent that was by making minor adjustments to the genetic structure. So the corporations argue and say that it's not genetically modified, but they had to genetically modify it slightly in order to be able to make a patent on it. Otherwise, they can't just own a naturally living bacteria, right? They had to make an adjustment. So that's just something out there. I mean, do we have research that genetically modified probiotics are not good for us? No, we actually have a lot of research that they're really good for us, but there's also tens of billions of dollars literally that have been thrown at this research because they're making so much money off of these probiotics. So again, I mean, it's just part of me being a purist. I'm trained as an herbalist and I use a lot of I read the research and I combine that with just this logical thinking of how did people do it? How have people been doing it for a long time? Mm-hmm. And obviously there's moments where people have been doing some weird stuff for a long time that's not necessarily sound science.
Right.
But I still think it's a relevant way to look at these situations and make some informed decisions of okay, what's logical here? And for me, what's really logical when it comes to fermented foods is looking for these more ancient probiotics and looking for wild probiotics. I think there's a lot to say about that. I think that increases our diversity. And we do know that when you increase the diversity of your gut microbiome, you decrease your risk of developing chronic health conditions.
That's a great point. And I think that for a long time, we've had this arc of health experts like you and me and our friends trying to find things that people weren't aware of that could be harmful. And there's always been things that have been legitimate concerns, but I think it's gone so far that many end up on diets that are highly, highly restrictive. And the pitfall is just what you're describing, the lack of this diversity in the gut flora. So great to find more ways to reverse that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of amazing to me too, because when you see people with this low microbial diversity, even if they're not, exhibiting major chronic illnesses, a lot of times they have issues with gas, with bloating. There's digestive impairment. They're probably not even absorbing their nutrients as well because they don't have all the bacteria to break down and ferment their food and further give them the nutrients that they need. So I think it's very problematic.
Just really quickly back to the possible GMO bacteria. Mm-hmm. Was that genetically modified or was that processed in some other way, like packaging or like protein coating, or are you aware of that distinction? Or
I'm not. I've actually done a lot of looking into this. Okay. And I'm not clear on what there's when you look at both sides, there's so much conflicting information that I'm just not 100% clear on how they have created this patent. I mean,
Okay.
I've been following this for a long time, and the stories have changed over the years, quite honestly.
Huh.
So it's interesting. I'm still digging into this and trying to figure out exactly how would you describe how they've patented it. And I am leaning towards the fact that they've done some sort of slight genetic alteration.
So apart from the concerns about this being a modified, perhaps it's unpredictable in some ways, but what are your thoughts about just commercial kombucha in general? Does it have some value as general digestive health apart from the caffeine, or is it something you would steer people away from? Or
I'm kind of mixed with it. I think it should be used from time to time for most people. For me, it's something that if I'm going to drink kombucha, it's going to be more of a party drink for me because I don't drink alcohol. So that would be my version of a party drink. Like, oh, I'll have 4 ounces of kombucha. Woohoo!
I'm quite a lightweight too. I'd get tipsy with you on that.
Exactly. No, I kind of feel it a little bit. But I also say that I was talking to a woman just recently, and she told me she drinks 2 bottles of kombucha per day, 32 ounces
Wow.
of kombucha. And I was like, girl, you just need to stop that now. And she texted me a week later and was like, okay, I've weaned myself down to about a half a bottle a day, and I feel a lot better. Because she was starting to tell me she was having some various issues. And I was like, that's because you're drinking too much kombucha. It was never meant to be drunk like that. When you look back in history, again, this is my favorite thing to do with this, is how did people interact with this food a long time ago? Because we've lost a lot of our cultural understanding about the way that foods fit together. They're all just out of context. And the way that people were drinking kombucha a long time ago was most likely in smaller amounts because sugar was not widely available. For them, it was probably quite the treat. And it was most likely, for people that were from Russia and China, they most likely had a lot of highly salted foods. And so kombucha would probably actually have been a miracle elixir for them, as it was called, because it was creating more balance in their body. It was adding a little bit of sugar. It was helping to create some electrolytes that would balance out that sodium intake. So I bet for them it was outstanding. But when we look at it, humans today, it's just more of the same in terms of sugar and caffeine and alcohol. But the nice things about kombucha, I will give it some good points here, is that it has lactic acid, it has a little bit of acetic acid, which is vinegar, and those are both food, essentially fertilizer for our gut microbiome. It's going to stimulate digestive juices as you're drinking it because it's sour. So it's going to help you digest your food more readily, especially even in the mouth when you're waking up all of your salivary enzymes. And it also, because it has the acetic acid in it, it's going to help with blood sugar. So we know that acetic acid, that vinegar has an ability to help blood sugar levels, to keep them from spiking after high carb meals. So I think that there is some benefit here for sure. And then there's other various organic acids like glucuronic acid, gluconic acid. There's just various other components here that are just going to be super helpful. And then of course there's polyphenols from the tea.
A few years back, probably 4 years ago, I set out to do a deep discussion on it. And my inclination was to try to find, I was on board that there's probably some health benefits, and I wanted to find just data to back that up and, have some good backing behind it. And all the studies I found back then, at least, were more so just case reports of people making it home and getting sick. That was the bulk of what I found.
I actually read those.
Is that an issue still, or?
No, it's not as big of an issue. I've read that. I know exactly what you're talking about. And it was just a small handful of studies that were sort of taken, or case reports that were taken out of context in terms of how many people were actually fermenting.
Sure.
It's such a small number of people. I remember there was one where somebody got some extreme liver complications. And it's just hard to say. I wish that I could see their SCOBY, and, because kombucha is fermented with a SCOBY as well. It looks like a flat, fleshy, I don't know what, fleshy blob. People call it a mushroom. It's really cool. It's really thick and meaty. It's really a neat texture. And I just would be really curious. I wish that somebody would have taken their scobies and looked at them, under a microscope at the very least, and found like what's growing in here. Because it very well could have been like a contaminated SCOBY that had aspergillus or some sort of mold that was creating, some aflatoxins.
So do you think that it's safe enough for consumers to make their own at home, or is that something you would advise people against? Or
I actually do. I think it is safe to make at home. I know a lot of people who do it. I teach people how to do it. I've done it myself a lot. And it generally smells really off when it's not done right. And that's the one thing about fermentation. Because of the acidity, there's not going to be a really strong chance of foodborne pathogens growing. And if something's off, it smells bad. So you can usually tell. And I think making kombucha at home is a really fun experiment. I'm actually performing one right now at home where I'm testing the sugar content of commercial kombuchas versus homemade kombuchas. And the results are not in yet, but I will let you know because I'm really curious. I'm making a video about it because I'm just so excited to learn, that's my biggest concern with people making it at home is adding too much sugar, having a more alcoholic kombucha, or just not fermenting it long enough and just drinking it when the sugar content is still really high and not realizing that you're basically just drinking this like sugary
sweet tea, right?
You're drinking sweet tea, people. So make sure you ferment it long enough to get as much of the sugar out as possible. That's very important.
Oh, that's cool. There's probably going to be a gap between this recording and when we release this. So please reach out with that data. We should be able to include that in the final version for the show notes. And
absolutely.
The generalization is longer fermentation is going to break down the sugar and leave it lower than it would be otherwise, right?
Absolutely. And when you look across the board at ferments, all the way from sauerkraut to kimchi, kombucha, often with these kinds of ferments, the longer they go, the better on many levels. There's all kinds of nutrients that are released, and the bacterial content tends to be higher. It's just a really cool thing, but it means that you have to be used to a more mature flavor. So you have to acquire that taste for ferments to be more mature when you enjoy them.
When you mentioned about the role of proper kefir or kimchi towards digestive health and constipation. So something else I'm going to have in the show notes, you made this really cool chart that talks about pairings, to where some conditions, some situations are good fits for some functional ferments and some are not so much. And you said we can share that with everyone here?
Absolutely. Yeah. If you go to gutrebuilding.com/Dr. C, DRC, I'll make sure that you can get access to that chart. I mean, it's very cool. It lists all kinds of different chronic health conditions, from histamine intolerance, leaky gut, insulin resistance. We've got various autoimmune disorders. We talk about, eczema, everything. Like, what do you need to be avoiding? What ferments do you need to be avoiding? And which ferments do you need to bring into your diet in order to have a better outcome?
That is really cool. That will totally be in the show notes. And then for the ferments you see on there, if they're ones that are readily available, so be it. But if they're ones that you need to learn how, then Summer Bock is the source for that. So, along those lines, folks who are making their own ferments at home, what are some big pitfalls that they might fall prey to? What are some things they'd want to really think through in that process?
I mean, let's think back to, again, how was this done traditionally? How were these foods made a long time ago? Information was passed down generation to generation. So it was always taught from one person to another. At this point in time, many people are missing that interaction. They're learning sometimes from watching maybe a YouTube video that you don't know if the person knows exactly what they're doing or not. They really may be completely unqualified. Or they're reading a book and not every book has every step listed out. So you may not be doing it exactly correctly. And so I think that's one thing to consider, is that, it's important to learn from people who are experienced doing this. And I think that if you can, either get in a physical environment with somebody or in some sort of virtual meetup group, which I know a lot of my fermentationists lead virtual meetup groups where they make ferments together on Zoom and watch each other and give each other advice. Because when there is someone there to watch you do it and give you some feedback, like, okay, it's done now, or don't fill the jar up too much there. There's just little steps that people will miss if they're not familiar with the process and they don't totally understand. It's just so much easier for us to learn from watching others do it. I really think so. So the reason this is important, and I'm all saying this to lead up to the fact that most people actually fail the first time they make a fermented food.
Oh, wow.
They're not difficult to make, but there's a lot of little steps, and you're dealing with bacteria, and there's potential mold that could come in. And, if you don't get all the steps, if you don't get it all exactly how it needs to be, then it can definitely mess up. And that's not a problem. I mean, failure is a fun part of fermentation. Some really cool things come out of it. Sometimes, most of the time, not edible, but sometimes, yeah, maybe still edible, but it's just a really cool place to be in experimentation and have fun with food. But I don't want people to ever be discouraged by a failure. Just because somebody has failed at it once or twice or multiple times, it doesn't mean that you can't ferment. Like, anyone can do this. You just have to know how. You just have to make sure you're doing the right things in the right order and the right way. And then at that point, really anyone can do it.
So I just thought about this. Actually, I don't know the story myself, even though I know you. Is how did you become enamored with fermentation? What brought you into that world?
Well, I was actually really sick. This was many, many years ago, and I had severe environmental allergies. And I had constipation, bloating, IBS symptoms. And I mean, my environmental allergies were so bad that the whites of my eyes would swell up, kind of like raised up over the iris a little bit. It was disgusting.
Wow.
And then I also had a lot of food allergies and food intolerances. And so I was really struggling. I mean, I was down to a point where there was about 30 foods that I could eat that I knew I wasn't going to have a reaction to. And I remember standing out on the corner one day, waiting for the bus. I was in college, and I was standing there, and I was seeing the pollen gust through the air, like yellow gusts of tree pollen, my nemesis at the time. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't handle this. And like, my eyes were watering, my nose was running, I was itchy all over. But I just had this epiphany. Wait a minute. I was born into this world. It does not make sense that I'm allergic to it. There is nothing sensible about this scenario at all. And I just decided in that moment, I was like, I'm going to cure myself of my allergies. And that's not something that at that point in time, this was like early 2000s. This wasn't something that I heard people ever talking about. Like, oh, I got rid of my allergies. Like, you didn't really hear that. People were like, no, I'm on allergy shots, or I just take Claritin every day, and I just have been doing that forever. I just decided in that moment. And I remember going to my doctor, and I remember she looked at me. It was really interesting because I'd been there a few times because of all the things going on. And I looked at her, and she said, "What are you doing here?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And I had already been studying so much about herbalism and nutrition. And like, I had worked with her patients, was helping them with health coaching and helping them get their diets right. And, getting some good results with her patients. And she was just sending everybody over to me. And we had a great relationship, but here I was dealing with all these complex health issues. It was so bizarre. And she said, you know more about this than I do. So, what are you doing here? And I was like, oh
That's
no.
wild.
The train has left the station and Summer is stranded in the middle of nowhere. Like, that's how I felt, Wow. And she goes, what? Like, I could write you a prescription. You're not going to fill it. I don't think it's going to do anything anyway. So really, what are you doing here? And so I left.
Wow.
And I thank goodness she was being honest with me. I mean, that's just where she was at.
What a straight shooter.
Right. I know. That's why she was my doctor, at least. Like, I like straight shooters. And so I went home and I just was like, okay, I've got to figure this out. And at that time I was taking herbs for digestion. I was taking herbs for my liver to try to clear up. I also was like covered in rashes and stuff, taking herbs for my liver to help with the rashes, taking herbs for my energy levels to, I was like doing all these things, trying to treat the symptoms all over the place. And then I met a naturopathic doctor who, she recommended probiotics for me. And I took the probiotics and I noticed actually quite a benefit from it. But again, I asked myself the purist question, the herbalist question, my ancestors didn't do this. They weren't popping little pills that were made in a laboratory 500 years ago. If this is an essential thing for us, what is the whole food version of probiotics? And that literally led me into like looking in the computer and like trying to find books on this topic. I came across Sally Fallon's book, Nourishing Traditions, and read it from cover to cover. My mom sent me the book Wild Fermentation by Sandor Katz, who's just like one of the first people to really start getting people more excited about this topic. I just started fermenting absolutely everything. I would ferment my butter. I was fermenting like literally every vegetable, like every food that I could put in my body. And in fact, I'll be honest, I did go a little overboard and my body did not like the amount of fermented foods I was putting in it. But for the first few months, it really made a difference. And then I had to learn to like back down a little bit and I had to find the sweet spot. And I was also, I actually used to own a sauerkraut company as well.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was fun. I was making so many fermented foods and fermented vegetables that I would put them in this fridge that was in my garage. And I was in college, and so like we had roommates and all their friends would come over all the time. And I remember that people would come over and I'd sell them these jars of kraut. And I remember that people would try it and, most people liked it, but I don't know, a certain percentage of people didn't care for it. But what was fascinating to me is that a week later, every single one of those people would come back and buy kraut and say, you know what, I took that one bite and I literally did not like it at the moment, but I have not stopped thinking about it since.
Huh.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I have discovered that this is the most addictive, healthy food I know of. And then I got contacted by some friends and we ended up starting a company. I sold it a few years ago to my business partner because I moved back home. It's all a cool story, but I mean, just to me, the big highlights there were just that it really is addictive. And I don't think that's not really the right word. What's happening, these bacteria are communicating to our bodies and our bodies understand. Like I say that bacteria and our cells, they're communicating using chemicals like hormones, neurotransmitters, like all these things communicate to these cells in our body. And these hormones and neurotransmitters and various other chemicals, they're basically text messages that our body is sending out to our cells. And what's interesting is it's like our body is on, like, let's say Verizon, and it's just like texting, whatever. They're texting back and forth. They're all telling each other what's going on, but the bacteria are cells too, and they can receive and send text messages as well. They just happen to be on a different carrier. Maybe they're on AT&T. And they're texting back and forth and they're communicating to each other. And I really, I love just the fascinating topic to me that they are having this communication and that people could have just a bite, and with one bite, there's enough information sent to their body to say, we want more of this.
That's really cool. So you talked about just fermenting all kinds of stuff. I just thought about this too. What are some of the most unexpected things that people would just never expect that you've fermented in the past?
Well, I've tried fermenting mushrooms, which worked. It was delicious. And I was
fermenting mushrooms. So now mushrooms are yeast already. So how would that work out? Just bacteria breaking them down, or? Well,
if you do it with lactic acid and you add just a little bit of vegetables in there to add in that lactic, the LABs, the lactic acid bacteria, and you give them some more food using the fiber and the starches from the vegetables, that lactic acid is essentially preserving the mushrooms.
Okay.
So it's not full on fermented, but they are, a little bit, but mostly you're just helping to preserve them in lactic acid instead of pickling them with vinegar, but it's delicious. Okay. Like it tastes so good. And you literally made probiotic mushrooms at that point.
That's awesome. I love mushrooms and I love fermented things. That's a cool combination.
I took a bath in sauerkraut brine once.
You took a bath in sauerkraut brine. So how much liquid did that take? That must have been 10 gallons or more? Or?
I diluted it. But I did a cool water because I wanted to keep it, it could have been, I guess 105 is probably where they would all die. So I kept it around 99, which to me is a cool bath. Sure. I put in a couple gallons.
How did that feel?
It was weird because it just smelled At that time, I owned my sauerkraut company, and it just smelled like I was sitting at work. I was like, oh, great. I'm in a bath and I'm trying to relax, and it smells like I'm at work. And it just like I just wanted to wash my skin off, whatever. I did it because I was just kind of curious, like, would something happen? Would my skin look different? Would it feel different? Because honestly, you're adding probiotics into your skin microbiome in that moment, but it's just not the most ideal way smell-wise.
I think about all the times, as a redhead, all the times I was horribly sunburned as a kid. And one of the most soothing things when mom would spray some dilute vinegar on it. And I imagine that would have felt wonderful if you had sunburn to just bathe in some cool sauerkraut liquid.
It probably would have been awesome.
So any other unusual things you fermented that might be worth mentioning? Or?
Well, I mean, tempeh, I know that's, people eat tempeh a lot, but it's a very, very interesting ferment.
How so?
Because you're taking beans and you're putting beans at in the danger zone is what we call it, right? Like the danger zone is that temperature, basically like room temperature where bacteria can thrive and grow rampantly. And we're putting beans out in the danger zone where these bacteria could putrefy it. But instead you add the right kind of culture, which is called Rhizopus oligosporus. Mm-hmm. And you add this culture to it, and it takes over the beans, and it prevents other pathogenic organisms from growing. And you get this protein that's broken down. It breaks down all the phytates. It makes a lot of the minerals more bioavailable. And it's cool to watch it grow. And it takes a few days, usually 2 to 4 days. And you have it in an incubator, and you have to check on it often. And there's a certain stage in the fermentation process where they start generating their own heat. And you have to make sure to vent and cool down your incubator so that they don't overheat. Wow. And I find that a really fascinating one, because it's not your everyday person making a fermented vegetable or kefir, like people who get into fermented foods. Kefir is not one that very many people actually make.
Huh. So the tempeh, then, how does the block structure form? Does that happen, or do you have to physically change it in some way to get the block shape? Or
the block shape is usually created, but a lot of people do it in plastic bags. Traditionally, it was done in banana leaves, and it's just kind of formed into like you kind of shape it. But then the Rhizopus oligosporus is a mold, and so it grows all this mycelium, and the mycelium creates enough structure to where it's solid, and it
so your beans hold themselves together from that.
Yeah, they're basically bound together by mycelial glue.
So then with natto, is that just you let the process go further, or how is that different?
Natto is different because it is fermented by, I believe, Bacillus. Oh, where's my... I believe it's a Bacillus. I'm trying to think if it's subtilis or is it natto. I think it's a Bacillus subtilis. And natto, I've actually made natto. It's a very, very challenging ferment. Because you have to sterilize everything, and you are using this bacteria that's making just a funky little mess with those beans. But I have to say, if as long as somebody doesn't have digestive issues, so it is a Bacillus, and because it's a Bacillus, they produce LPS, like lipopolysaccharides, which is the chemical that irritates the gut lining, and it can be hard on the immune system. It's not a great component. I'm sure some people have heard about LPS. And because of that, it's not going to be a great option for folks with digestive issues or certain immune issues. But for those people who are relatively healthy, I actually think that natto is such a cool ferment, because it has natto kinase, which is an enzyme that, as far as I know, it's only made in natto. You can only find it in natto. Natto
occurring, I think so.
Yeah. And so this amazing enzyme, which can help with cardiovascular health, and, it has some really cool properties to it. So I think, people could get it into their diet, try it. I heard that it takes 8 times to try it before you like it.
8 times. That's cool. Super high in vitamin K2 as well. Yeah, it's a neat food.
It's such a neat food. And I'll say there's some varieties or some companies that make it better than others. And there's one out of Santa Cruz that I've tried, and I just find their natto absolutely fantastic. And the thing that I've noticed is that when I eat it, I have this feeling of satiation unlike any other feeling. Like, and there's no other food I've ever eaten in my life that gives me the feeling of satiation that I get with natto.
Wow. Does that company ship? Maybe after we're done, you could forward me a link. We get that in the show notes too.
Yeah, I'll look for it. I'll definitely look for it because it's nice when it's delicious, and there's just something about natto, and you've basically taken all of these pieces of a bean, protein, starches, and you've broken it down into all these free amino acids. So
that's cool.
Any of the bean ferments, the legume ferments like natto or tempeh or miso, that's
fermented black beans.
Do what?
Fermented black beans also.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, right. Like the little fermented black beans. Mm-hmm. Those are so high in free amino acids that your body can utilize without having to do any work. And I work with so many people with digestive impairment, and I'm finding, like, I know that you can't be quote unquote protein deficient because there's protein in everything, but I just have noticed that when people's digestion is impaired, they're not getting the amino acids that they need. They're not. So in some levels, they are a little bit protein deficient.
Sure.
And I feel like these foods are such a great way to bring in the kind of protein that our body actually needs in a digestible form. And that's the coolest thing. Like, our digestive systems are weak compared to most other animals. And we've got this amazing ability to use our hands and have these symbiotic relationships with all of these scobies and bacteria and probiotics. And we can ferment these foods and make them pre-digested essentially so that we can thrive.
That was a phenomenal summary. So the listeners, I highly encourage you guys to come to the show notes because there's a lot more to learn in this. I'm going to have a lot of links to Summer and her page, and that chart is so cool. I think you remember, Summer, when you first told me about that, my jaw just dropped. I'm like, that is the coolest thing ever. Everyone needs to have that.
I do remember.
So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate this. And yeah.
Absolutely. This was super fun. I appreciate just being able to have this conversation with you. I learned a lot too.
All right. And listeners, thanks so much for tuning in. Always glad to be with you as well. And we'll see you back real soon. Take great care. Hey, Dr. Christensen here. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. Is there a topic you'd like me to cover? I'd love to hear from you. Just go to Dr. Alan Christensen on Facebook or Instagram, write your question, and use the hashtag #MedicalMyths. Did you find this show helpful? If so, please take a minute and leave us a rating on iTunes so that others can know. Thanks much. I'll be back with you real soon. Bye-bye.